Okay, let's go ahead and get started with Akins. Sorry for being a few minutes late. We left off talking about some of his portraits. Akins becomes increasingly interested in portraiture through his career. But one of the things that we find is that a vast majority of the portraits, at least earlier on in his career, and by the way, he lives, well into the 20th century. But a number of the portraits early in his career are portraits of friends and family contacts that he has. And this sort of leads to the portrait commissions, although the Gross Clinic, as we read, was a very particular work in that it was intended for the Centennial Exhibition, right? But Samuel Gross was someone who Akins had sought out at Jefferson Medical College, went to his anatomy lessons, not surgeries like this one, right, but the actual anatomy lessons, because Akins felt so strongly that artists should study anatomy. This is the root of his problem, right? We talked about this earlier in the week, that we think about Akins, the degree to which his career seems to be sort of the trajectory of his career is based on this idea of the human body, right? That seems to be like a major theme for him. He's just so interested in anatomy and the body within the composition that is something you just can't get past with all of his works is that level of focus. And even when he's a young artist, right, he begins to go to these anatomy lessons when he's a teenager, right, late teenager, and then ends up going to Paris. And who does he seek out when he's in Paris? But an artist who does the nude as part of his theme, Gérôme, right? Jean-Léon Gérôme. And that sort of cements the idea that the human body is at the core of it all. And then he comes back and he's the sportsman, right? He's an amateur sportsman, oarsman. And when we read the fact that he didn't want professional models in his life drawing studios, first he wants life drawing studios, which is itself is something of a problem in America because we're prudes, right? We're a bunch of Puritans. And the idea of wanting to put somebody naked in the classroom was for a lot of Americans in the 19th century difficult and problematic. But in addition to that, he wants fit people. He wants athletes to pose, not just fat prostitutes. So this is why it sort of goes to this point. Well, let's get my students, myself, because he's an oarsman. He's a boatman himself to do these things. On the other hand, with Akins, one of the things that, in addition to this interest in the human body that we've seen with Akins, I'll mention two other things. One is that, and we'll talk about this more, meticulousness of approach, just an absolute sort of zeroing in on details that might seem inconsequential, details of procedure that you might think, what's the point, right? We're doing perspective studies for waves on the river, right? What's the point? But he's that kind of finicky, that kind of meticulous, which I think ties into the idea of anatomy studies, right? If you're going to paint the human body, well, even if it's a portrait, man, you better know your way around the zygomatic arch, right? The muscles and the bones that lay beneath the skin. You better know what they do if you're going to do this well, right? And you better know how the rules of perspective affect waves breaking on the water if you're going to do it well. That meticulous fits in with everything. But the other thing for Akins that is of particular interest is, and one of his great strengths, especially in portrait painting, is his ability to capture psyche and internal character. And I think this comes back to something we talked about on Tuesday, which is the way in which oftentimes he'll take moments of reflection, right? So when we looked at the Bigland brothers racing, we saw it's that moment before the starting gun, and they're both just kind of keyed into the action, right? Waiting for the gun. And in particular, Barney in the back of the boat looking down and waiting for his brothers. He's waiting for his brother's oar to move, right? And he'll know to move in just a particular way, and he'll go. And they'll start off together, and they'll get the jump, right? It's like a ski jumper listening to the beeps up there, in the Winter Olympics or something, right? It's just that moment of intense concentration where, or like a sprinter, right? Usain Bolt getting off of the shoe is as important as anything else, right? Is how do you, or a competitive swimmer. Like when you hear the gun and you go, you can lose the race right there, you know, because that kind of attention is necessary. Focus and reflection before action. And even with the portraits, okay, Gross is reflection before action as well, or between actions, right? He's removing that dead bone from the leg of the patient, and he's stopping to explain, but he's not really talking. He's sort of thinking it through, right? The thoughtfulness that lies behind action. See how this all kind of fits together because of the way Akins approaches his work, right? It's not impressionist at all. Even though he went to Paris at a time when the impressionists were beginning to break the rules, right? They weren't called impressionists yet, right? But Monet is out there, right? Manet is out there. Pissarro is out there. He's not breaking the rules. He's adhering to them, at least the academic rules, very, very closely. And he sees his work as being thoughtful and deliberative. And he brings that same interest to his subject matters as well. The people are thoughtful and deliberative, right? So Gross is not just jumping into action. He's working his way through methodically, carefully, and slowly. Almost like an avatar for Akins himself. And Amelia Van Buren, also reflective, but in a very different way, but still capturing her psyche so very strongly. That melancholy that she said she felt, where she was anxious over everything, that plagued her life, right? That had been diagnosed as this neurological disorder, probably misdiagnosed as a neurological disorder in the 19th century. It's hard to say what she might have really suffered from now. But nonetheless, and she was also a friend of his, right? She was an ex-student, one of his students from the life drawing classes back at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and remained friends with them in the many years after, right? By this point, Akins has been relieved of his duties, and yet there she is still coming to visit. Another portrait by him, he said this one was much less successful. I always kind of liked it, but I think what he means by that is that it doesn't have that same intense psychological insight that we get from the other portraits by him. He's also reflecting, right? Pausing to ostensibly pose for the picture with his books open on the stand next to him, in between activities, if you will. But when we look at his face, it just seems more sort of like a topographical study rather than trying to dive more deeply and understand the psyche of the figure. Right? But again, just for a portrait that's dominated by a single color where most of the interior is cast in shadow to highlight the doctor and his books and his writing implements, right? Despite all of that, Akins was equally meticulous in his approach, right? Now, Brinton, this is on loan to the National Gallery. It doesn't belong to them. It actually belongs to the National Museum of Health and Science. And Brinton was a pupil of Samuel Gross, right? So he is the next generation of doctors. And who knows if he's not ostensibly people back in the audience here, right? But he studied under Gross. And when Gross eventually stepped down at Jefferson Medical College, Brinton succeeded him. He's the next sort of president of Jefferson Medical College after Samuel Gross, right? And he's very, very well known, as Gross was at the time. He'd served in the Civil War. He was a prominent veteran of the Civil War. And he had written a history of the war from a surgical point of view, the surgical history of the Civil War. That remained a textbook for decades afterwards, right? He was really, really prominent as a scholar. And so this is why Akins chooses to show him next to this podium with his books and his writings, right? To illustrate that. Eventually, he became the first curator at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, who went on to own the picture, right? So this is all sort of part of the background of this. But like I said, it's every bit as meticulous as anything else. Perspective study, right, for the room, to get the chair right. And again, an approach to art that's somewhat foreign to us because the Impressionists kind of ruined everything, right? Where we now think it's okay to just sketch it out and get in there. And it is okay to sketch it out and get in there, but that's not the way that Akins works, right? Akins is much more interested in making sure that the perspective is just so. And you'll notice that not only does he give us the vanishing point in the center part of the room, right? But in addition to that, the diagonal lines that are cutting off to the side are to get the pattern in the rug proper, right? Just like the waves on the water. You know, if he's going to have that rug, and he probably has a copy of the rug hanging on the wall, right? But if he's going to get the way in which that pattern works and doesn't violate the perspective, then he needs these diagonal lines to figure out how that recedes into space as well. It's a quasi-scientific approach to art. And I think that for Akins, this is such a fascinating thing, because if we think about the Samuel Gross picture, does Akins see himself in Gross as a skilled professional with tools by which he understands the world, analyzes and investigates and understands the world by the skillful use of a set of professional tools, right? And I kind of like that analogy, right? That he's very methodical and quasi-scientific in the way that he approaches every painting. These are not just illustrations, right? This is an attempt to understand how nature works, right? And how does the artist capture it accurately? He drew out a ground plan, right, of the room. So the little trapezoid there is where the chair sits, and everything just measured out, right? And again, an approach to art that is just absolutely odd by modern standards, to think about going about making paintings this way. With the idea that he has paintings where he sees a symbiosis, a connection between him and the person. I think this image of William Rush is very, very similar. Rush is in the background carving in wood. He's got the mallet and the chisel, right? And he's making a wooden carving. And he's pausing for a second, right, before he positions the chisel in the right place and gives it a whack to knock off more of the wood to carve the leg, right? He's like Gross. He's pausing before he cuts, right? A professional at work in the skilled use of his tools. And this idea that maybe, just maybe, and this total interpolation on my part, right? Total assumption, that Akins sees himself in this guy, right? Can be taken from the fact that he's carving a clothed figure while studying a naked one. So the model is ostensibly posing for that sculpture, right? But instead of having a branch of wood on her shoulder, she's got a book, something heavy, right? And instead of being draped, she's naked. The drapery is made up in William Rush's mind, right? That again that's Akins. For Akins, the study of the nude leads to everything else, right? And he shows his artist, his idealized artist, studying the nude as opposed to anything else. Right? Now, this is a commemorative picture. This is not a friend of his or anything. William Rush carved this statue, this allegorical figure, back in 1808, which is a good 30 plus years before Akins was ever even born. Right? The reason Akins is interested in William Rush and this fabricated, idealized scene from 1808, in other words, it's nothing that he saw, right? He's making this entirely up. But the reason he's interested in it is that William Rush actually founded the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, right? He was the first founding director of that museum. And at this point, Akins had just joined the faculty, right? So he's now carving the original president, right? Or not painting the original president. Hard at work. And on a certain level, when we think about that confluence of events, that this is Akins joining the staff, joining the faculty, painting the original founder of the institution he has just joined, painting that guy using the nude model for a clothed figure, which, by the way, was historically inaccurate. In 1808, people did not do that in the studio, right? Professional models only start to be used regularly around 1840 or so, right? So Akins is making a statement here about how art is made from the nude model in the studio at a time when he is going to be pioneering the use of the nude model in the studio. So it becomes almost a pictorial justification. Hey, what I'm doing isn't bad. Look, the founder of the institution did it too, right? I am just following in the footsteps of William Rush. It's propaganda's way, right, to justify what Akins was doing and what Akins was certainly criticized for having done. Right? We've talked before about how Akins loves looking back at earlier periods of art as inspirations for his works. Never direct quotes, but certainly Rembrandt has been for him an inspiration for other pictures. And this is a wonderful print by Rembrandt. This is an etching that he purposely left unfinished. Right? He never etched in the entire thing. Of the artist drawing from the model, we see behind the artist this monster heavy-duty easel with a canvas on it, and the darkened background with a bust of a figure lit by candlelight, right? But Rembrandt leaves it unfinished just to give you a sense of artistic process, because it fits the theme, the artist at work, right? And we see the print as it. Well, Akins has seen prints, one of these impressions, right? As an etching, there are multiple impressions. And it's pulled the same idea and basically reworked the composition. The model, nude, back to us, similar positioning. The artist, also similar positioning, but now translated from a painter or a draftsman into a sculptor, right? So certainly borrowing on this. Now, as a totally meticulous artist, Akins studies everything, right? Goes back and makes sketches of William Rush's statues. He even makes three-dimensional casts, makes sculptures of them himself, including a sculpture of William Rush's head, right? In order to be able then to paint the head properly. Because again, he has to understand it in 3 dimensions. We've seen that in his work, right? I've got to get this in 3 dimensions before I can put it in the 2 dimensions. So ground plans and perspective studies. And in this case, we get him making actual clay and wax 3-dimensional models of the things he's going to paint because he feels he needs to understand it first. Right? So here's a sketch of the allegorical figure, the water nymph that Rush is carving on as we speak, made from the original carving. Right? And again, he wants to understand it, so he makes these different sketches of it. Hard to see, but behind the chaperone, right? And by the way, the chaperone's really an important figure in this. But behind the chaperone, there's another statue. Can you see that back there? And on the wall next to it is a sketch with little notes, right? That's what's written in white there about the final work of art, right? And how this is going to fit into it. The statue in the background behind the chaperone is a statue that Rush had carved of George Washington, right? A wooden statue of Washington. You can see the pose is really quite similar here. And this is where I think this picture, actually, we've been talking so seriously about Akins, but I think he's got like a really strange sense of humor. Because there's the naked model, which is the focus of all of this negative energy, right? It's the focus of all of this skin is his use of the naked model. And he makes sure that we know she's naked, right? That she's not some sort of muse, because look at her clothes are right there in the foreground, piled up in front of you, you know. But the statue of Washington, it's like he's looking right at him. You know, he can put that statue facing any direction he wants. He can turn, you know, it's a painting, it's made up, right? And he puts it so that Washington turns, and he's looking directly at the breasts of that model, right? And it's almost like he's, whoa, the father of our country, sort of like looking. And I think that Akins is sort of making a comment here about, the puritanical nature of America, and how really in the long run everything is kind of okay. Even if old people like Washington might have been shocked, right? Keep in mind that when William Rush is carving this, there were no Native models used, and Washington was only about 10 years dead, right? Still, I think Akins is saying, get rid of that attitude, right? That nudity in the studio is a professional business. And there is no problem here, right? This is a professional, right? We are like doctors, right? We are like Samuel Gross. There is no problem with this whatsoever. While it might look like it's got a lack of propriety from the clothes flung onto the chair to remind us quite clearly that she should be wearing something and isn't. Despite that fact, the chaperone is unconcerned. Right? I think that's why the chaperone is such an important figure, that she's not like watching Rush, given an evil eye, worried about anything. She's not even really paying attention to what's going on in the studio. Right? She's going about her knitting. That's because everything's fine. She knows comfortably that no hanky-panky is going to happen here. Which is what was the cause of all the scandal, is that when you introduce sex into the studio, Akins' message is, one, it's been around all the time. Two, only the founding fathers in their puritanical age might have been upset. Right? Three, there's nothing to worry about. Right? And of course, the founder of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts did it. So it's layered with all of these messages about the use of the model in the studio. And I think that for him, even though originally the work is intended as a commemorative work to honor the institution he has just joined, he's using it for these other messages, right? Using it for these messages about his practice as an artist. Now, he returns to the theme 30 years later. 1908, he comes back to paint it again in two different versions. He never says exactly why, but 1908 is the centennial anniversary of when that statue was carved. So that might have inspired him to go back to it. Right? So one copy is in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and you can see it's basically the same idea. Rush with the statue is in the same pose, but has been just sort of shifted to the other side. The model is in a very similar pose on that same sort of chopping block, right? Again, the chaperone equally unconcerned, right? We've lost George Washington, and instead his shop is simply filled with all of these tools of the trade. Even though he'd worked out the composition in great detail before, he goes back and works it out in great detail again, right? He goes through all of the same steps to get to the final composition that he had gone through the first time, including various studies of the different figures that will appear, such as the chaperone in front of the model to the left, right, in a local collection. Works it through not only studies of the individual figures, but again through compositional studies to work out the final composition. So in the Hirshhorn, we have quite a few Akinses in the Hirshhorn. It's very, very small. You can probably tell from the resolution. A very, very small study to work out the overall composition, where the different figures fit in. So again, it's a reworking, right? He's already got the original idea, but he wants to work it out again. And in doing so, he just goes through the exact same steps he went through 30 years ago. Right? That's his meticulousness. That's just the way he works. And I think that these works are every bit as filled with justification for his mode of working as the original one was. Right? So the second version sort of scraps everything all together And now the model is being helped down from her post after he's done carving. He's still got the mallet in his hand, and he's gently helping her step down from the podium, uh, touching her as well. Studies for this version as well, one in the Smithsonian American Museum, a nice sketch for the model as she's stepping down from the podium. And these works, even though now this is 20 years after the scandal that ended his job, right? I think there's still the ideas about what Akins thinks the studio is all about is here. And in our reading, right, that last Doyle reading that we had, one of the things it talked about was the fact that he would touch the model, right? Which we've been in life drawing classes. Those of us that have know that you just don't do that, right? There's a bubble, right? Like the cone of silence, if you will, or the safety bubble. You just don't, because if you're being really professional, then you're not treating them. It's going to sound bad, but I don't mean it bad. You're not treating them like a human. You're treating them like a professional engagement, right? And the idea of contact is unheard of, right? That adds a level of exactly what Akins doesn't want, which is the sexualizing. He sees himself like a doctor. He sees himself as above that. But here, William Rush, the founder of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, from which Akins was fired, is touching the nude model, which is exactly one of the things, one of the charges that was leveled against Akins, was contact with nude models in the studio. Right? Have to bring this in. There he is, with one of his students posing for a photograph. Right? I didn't want to shake your hand in the office. There's just these days anymore. But so I would never go that far, right? And you wouldn't want me to, right? And it's just, there's something about this that's just creepy on 15 different levels, Like there's no way to look at this and not think it's creepy, I think. On a certain level, how is it not creepy? He may think he's the most professional man in the world, and that by posing like this, he thinks of himself as some sort of modern embodiment of a Greek ideal of natural beauty. And that's exactly what he does think. But that still doesn't make it okay, And so the Rush picture, the second version at least, I think seems to reach out and directly address some of the charges that he's probably 20 years after he got sacked, still grumbling about, right? Now, as we know, the picture that was at the core of the getting sacked was the swimming hole, right? Which again, it's hard to understand how this didn't seem creepy. A trustee asks Akins for a picture, right? One of the board of trustees. And you guys know about board of trustees? We've got one here at Marymount, right? So, okay, any kind of institution, educational institution, but lots of them, have the internal administrative structure, right? So I've got, if I were chair of my department, I would have a chair, right? And that chair, or in this case me, answers to the dean. So if one of my faculty members does something stupid, they come and talk to me. If I do something stupid, I go talk to the dean, right? It's like going to the principal. I go talk to the dean. And the dean then answers to the provost, who's the vice president of this institution. And they answer to the president, Matt, right? And Marymount's weird in that we all call Matt Shank, the president. He likes being on a first name basis with people. He's just like the friend you'll never ever. He's quit it, right? And we're searching for. We are never going to find anybody as friendly as Matt ever. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. He's a one-off this way, and it's perfect for Marymount. It's just kind of what this makes this a great place to be. Is that family sense, Hey Matt, right? And anyway, okay. Above the president, right? And there are other branches of, there's a chief financial officer who's in charge of the budget, right? who's kind of at the same level as the provost, but on the money side versus the teaching side, right? They'll sort of come down. In addition to that, our operations every year go to a group of 15 or so people who have donated significant amounts of money to the institution, who are the board of trustees. They have been entrusted with the proper care and management of the institution. They trust us quite a bit, and I say us very lightly because I have very little to say in it, right? The decisions are made up there. We can advise them, but they don't have to follow our advice. That's just kind of the way things work, right? And the board of trustees, these 15 people who have given lots of money, they'll sometimes show up at your commencement activities and whatnot. But they get the final say on decisions that the institution makes. So every year, as we decide what's going to happen with next year's money, right? We get some fees and whatnot. We can project how much money's coming in. This is how we're going to spend it. That has to go to the board of trustees to be approved. Right? And they can say no. They can say, we hired 2 new people in the last few years in my department, right? They could say, no, we're not going to approve you even looking for somebody next year. We want you to save that money and use it somewhere else. Right? They have that kind of say. So there's a board of trustees for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, right? And they are the people that really guide the institution and its vision, right? And is kind of an honorary position that comes from fundraising. And one of the board of trustees, a guy named Coates, right, came to Aikens and said, I'd like a picture for my office. And unlike our board of trustees, he had an office on campus, right? Ours don't. Ours are all business people. They don't stay here. 19th century, they tended to be on campus. So he comes to Aikens, I'd like a picture. And Aikens started talking to him a bit and found out that the 2 of them knew of this spot on the river. That they spent a lot of time on this spot on the river outside of Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, as kids. And he thought, that's a great. Nostalgic view of peaceful life outside the city. And he gives them this, right? Which is recognizable portraits of his students naked at that site. And the trustee member, our board of trustees probably couldn't pick Allie or Alton out of the lineup. If I couldn't pick me out of the lineup, right? They were much more sort of deeply engaged with it as a small, different kind of world, right? So recognizable portraits of his students to hang in your office, right? And the guy in the water in the lower right corner is Aikens, right? In the lower right corner, that's him swimming, lurking in the corner, and ostensibly there. And again, Aikens has this idea that this is professional activity. It is above scandal. And he's been hearing it already, right? And I just think he is sticking to his guns and then some. Like, this is not my problem, this is your problem. And the only solution is not for me to change, but for you to get over it. That's his response, right? I'm not going to compromise. It's up to you to get over it. Now, the entire work is, again, very meticulously worked out. And in this case, the picture that's on the right already gets us here. In addition to all the kinds of sketches we've seen, right? Ground plans, perspective studies. Aikens is also using photographs, right? And you can, by the way, tell, if you look at the waves that are coming off the kid's arm that's diving, you know he's using perspective studies again, right? It's just, he's getting the recession of the size of the waves into the distance like just right. But he and his group go out swimming, and they take a bunch of pictures, right? He's got a camera. Some of the photos are by him. Some of them he's in it, so there is in the water just past that log on the right. Basically, this happened, right? This can be documented. It's not like he made this up and put his students' faces on it. He went out and said, I'm going to make this picture. Come on, guys. Let's go swimming, right? And swimsuits be damned. Here we go. And has a vast number of pictures taken of them hanging out at the swimming hole, and these then become the basis for the finished picture, right? And you can see, I think, as they're posed, and these are all very much posed, that they're meant to be a sort of back to nature sort of thing. You know what I mean? The pictures have a sort of, I don't know, Arcadian idea about them? Right? You know what I mean when I say Arcadian? I know Allie does because she took that class, but Arcadia is in Greek mythology a land where time stood still, where the progress of the modern world never, ever creeped, right? It's other things creep. But the modern world never got there, and time stood still, and everything was perfect. People lived in harmony with the land, right? They lived out in nature, as close to nature as they could possibly be, and this was seen as perfection, as ideal, as an idyllic and perfect and timeless time. And when Akins and his circle pose these images, take these photos, the figures are posing as if they're languid and there's no time passing, and that they're almost as if they're Greek gods in the countryside. None of them are really much contact with each other. If they do touch each other, there's no sort of cozying up or pulling away. But it's not impossible to imagine how this ever flew, right? How this ever worked. Again, all these photographs lead to studies. The Hirshhorn has a study for the swimming hole, and you can see that as we move from the photos to the study, that a lot of the full frontal nudity, which is very uncomfortable in some of those photos, is muted. That's maybe his one concession, is to get people to turn to the side or lift their knee, right? Turn their back, so that we're not actually looking at the money shot, as they say. And this comes out already in the study itself. But the other thing that comes out through the study and the finished picture is the degree to which he begins to really play with the composition in a way that is very traditional in other ways. And for example, if you look at the posing of the three figures that are on top of that shelf of rock, you can see how they form part of a triangle, a pyramid, if you will. From the reclining figure to the man on his knees to the standing figure. They become like Greek statues from a temple, Greek gods. And for Akins, he mentioned this on no uncertain terms, that modern athletes were for him proof that Greek sculptors who did statues of athletes were working from real life, right? That the human body is at the core of the Western tradition of art for him. And he poses at the swimming hole these figures as if they're half of a pediment. And they're as great to the 19th century as Phidias's statues are for the Parthenon, right? These are in London, but they're originally from the Parthenon in Athens. And you can see the posing of these becomes very, very similar. And in fact, the pose of the guy kneeling down is awfully similar to an earlier Greek sculpture as well, a dying warrior that also came from a pediment, right? So he's giving them this classicism, and that adds to his overall message that it's okay. It's always been okay. There's nothing wrong with this, is what he's trying to say. Like I said, it's still hard to imagine that he could ever get anybody to agree with him, and he didn't, right? Except to the degree that now, in the late or early 21st century, we can look back at these and say, wow, these are kind of fascinating. Not only in their weirdness, but also in Akins' approach. Right? Our next American artist, and probably the last one we'll look at in class, because he's going to take a bit. We'll look at her down the next guy as well, is Mary Cassatt. Now, we've been talking with both Homer and Akins about the fact that we have these artists who've gone to Paris, right? Both Homer and Akins go to Paris in 1866. Don't seem to have rubbed shoulders very much, or they must have known each other. And Mary Cassatt goes there the same year, 1866. She's also in Paris. So these three different American painters all working in Paris at the same time. We're pretty sure that Cassatt and Akins knew each other there, because they're both from Philadelphia. Actually, Cassatt's originally from Pittsburgh, but she had been taking classes in Philadelphia. She had gone to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, right? Which is where Akins would eventually teach. Now, she was there in the early 1860s, before Akins is a teacher there, right? Akins doesn't start teaching until 1875. But at that point, Akins is going over to do anatomy studies with Gross and whatnot at the medical college, and Cassatt is taking lessons at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, early 1860s. Her dad is pretty wealthy. He's a stockbroker. And in 1866, she convinces Dad to let her go to Paris to study art there, right? To pick up on what's going on in modern circles of Parisian art. And he says, okay. And 1866 to 1870, she spends 4 years in Paris. Don't you wish your parents were that cool, right? And that wealthy to send you off for 4 years to Paris just to study painting? But she does, right? So for 4 years, Cassatt is studying in Paris. And these are the same 4 years or so that Akins is there. And the fascinating thing, and this is why we think they must have known each other, is they both took lessons with the same artist, Jean-Léon Gérôme, who really helped instill in Akins the meticulousness of layout, the sharpness of detail, and the importance of the human body. That same artist is also teaching Cassatt. And in the long run, she goes in a very different direction than Akins. Her works and Akins's works really wind up looking almost nothing like each other, even though they seem to have come from very similar roots. And that's because of their interests and their approach. For Akins, revival of classicism, right? This interest in ancient Greece as personified through modern athletes. Yeah? For Cassatt, it's something very different. It's really more about her personal experiences, which we'll see as we look at her works. Now, both of them come back at exactly the same time, 1870. And the reason they both come back is that Paris is in the middle of a war. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 kind of destroys Paris, right? After Bismarck decides to invade and throw Emperor Napoleon III out, right? There's this Paris revolts against that. They mount what's called the Paris Commune, declare themselves independent from the rest of France, and the Prussian army comes and kicks their butt too, right? And leaves about half of the city in ruins. Well, it's no place for a foreigner, right? Just as today, when the State Department would call you home, if you were visiting a foreign country and a war broke out, the same thing more or less happened then. It became time to leave, right? And so Cassatt comes back in 1870, stays in America for about a year and a half, then goes back to Europe again, right? And while she's in Europe, she doesn't go right back to Paris because things are a mess. She goes to Italy instead. Spends about 2 years in Italy and does side trips to Spain, to Belgium, to Holland. She wants to go see as much art as she can in Europe because she's kind of figuring out her way. She's figuring out where she's going to go with her particular painting. And in this respect, she's going to sort of break the spell of the realism of Gérôme, right? So our biography, right? Paris, back to the U.S., back to Europe in 1872, finally settles in Paris again in 1874, and stays there for the rest of her life. This is what sets her apart from Akins, right? We often discuss Cassatt instead with the Impressionists as a French artist because she spends so much of her career there, right? Akins, after his Parisian experience, comes back and inserts himself as an American, never goes back. Doesn't even seem to be interested in going back. Cassatt, however, wants that life and lives in Paris. Part of it is that her family, Cassatt's family, goes back to the 16th century as having French roots. So this is her traditional homeland, she thinks, right? I guess it'd be like the Trowbridges going back to England somewhere and finding where the bridge on the River Trow is and settling there, right? Finding that ancestral homeland is what Cassatt is most interested in. In this case, it's her nephew, Edward Buchanan Cassatt, or Eddie, as the family called him. Other members of the family were often there because of the French roots. And eventually her father and her sister, I think her mother, come to live in Paris as well in 1877. This is a little bit before that, right? So it's her cousin. And in fact, it's signed at the bottom. Instead of saying Mary Cassatt, it says Aunt Mary, right? This is a gift from your Aunt Mary. And it stayed in their family up until 2 years ago, right? This was still in the Cassatt family. At which point it was dedicated. I love this picture. This is the family members. It's the granddaughters donating the work to the president of the National Gallery, right? And so there they are with Grandpa Eddie, as they called him. And this is from the Post when they gave the work over to the National Gallery. So now it's hanging as our most recent acquisition of the Cassatt from just 2015. That's all. Right. So here, let's now look at what she's doing. It's a portrait of her nephew, and you'll notice as you look at the picture that it's primarily just sort of two colors, right? It's the olive of the background drapes and the red of his costume, and everything else is sort of in that color scheme of a two-tone painting, which is in itself a very difficult thing to pull off well, right? To limit your color. You probably remember this from my color theory class, right? Do a duochrome work. You get one color in black and white. So, right? I remember hating that, right? But there we are. This is kind of there. It's red and go, right? Maybe a little bit of olive to offset it a bit. But it's really fantastic as a tour de force in that it's her ability to sort of make what seems to be a complete, fully tonal picture with just really two tones. As we look closely at it, we also see the lessons of her travels. As I mentioned, from Italy, she's been going various places, including Holland. And we know the artist that she was most interested in. She left a lot of correspondence. And, in particular, she loved the portraitist Frans Hals, who worked in Haarlem. And one of the things I think you can already see from looking at them side by side, one is a monochromatic tint, right? Hals does limited color range really, really well, right? But more than that, look at how the brushstrokes in Frans Hals look. Look at the sleeve, look at the neck ruff, look at the face, look at the background. And you can see the sort of a scrubby, sketchy quality, where the brushstrokes are laid down with no attempt to blend them. And as you dive in close to his sleeve, it becomes these sort of just jittery sketches that still look wet in the way he applies the paint, right? And we see something similar in the way that Cassatt is approaching her work. And a lot of people mention that at this point in her career, in the early, mid-1870s, Cassatt is still sort of figuring out where she's headed, right? She's studying yet. And at this point, she's just settled in Paris after traveling through Belgium and Holland and Spain, and is beginning now to sort of pick up what am I going to do as a painter, right? Where am I going to go? And in particular, what's my style of painting going to be, right? And what she's doing is she's assimilating a lot of different influences into that work. Right? And in this case, Hals is one of them. Certainly the sort of interest in sort of direct engagement with the portrait sitter. But over and above that, and most importantly, I think, is the application of paint, which you can see in this detail, has that same Frans Hals sketchiness. Right? Hals was not really popular in the 19th century, but artists responded to it, right? If you read people who wrote about art history in the 19th century, they would forget about it. They just talk about Rembrandt, right? But artists were getting it because they would look at his works and see something that was extraordinary, something that really broke most of the rules. When she was in Spain, she was looking at Velázquez, the court painter to the King of Spain, Philip IV. And from Velázquez, she also gets this interest in flashy brushwork. But in addition to that, one of Velázquez's great strengths, and we see it in numerous pictures, is the ability to compose a picture with just one or two tones. Where almost everything within the picture in this particular case is that blue and maybe spots of that red in the background, but the red is very muted. Right? A limited color palette portrait. Plus the sort of monumentality of the figure, the framing against these sort of background drops. All of this sort of reeks of Velázquez. And she's been seeing his works and commenting on them as she went to Spain as well. And just to give you a sense of what Velázquez looks up close, her right sleeve, where you can see how his approach to applying the paint is in fact very, very similar to hers. Right? So she's casting her net all over. People even suggest he's looking at Goya, another Spanish artist whose work she could have seen on going to Madrid, a court painter to a later French king, Carlos IV, and these wonderful images of children with pets as surrogates, and Cassatt picking up on those as well. So she's sort of jumbling up these influences, right, from Dutch painting to Spanish painting, as she's now staving out on her career. In the American Museum, there's a Spanish dancer picture from the period when she's in Spain, right? This is during her travels. And so she's already, while she's there, not just studying the great painter she sees in the museum, but is inspired by them to begin to paint Spanish subjects as well. And this becomes a huge influence on her as she begins her career. Right? So Cassatt is this American, sort of sweeping up a ton of European influences, mostly from the 17th century, and bringing them into her work. In Paris, in the late 19th century, Cassatt is not the only one interested in Spanish art. It's not like it's unique, right? In fact, her interest in Spanish art might well have been inspired by other painters in Paris. Remember, she'd already been there, 1866. She goes back again in 1874. Right? So in the interim, after coming back to America to wait out the war, right, in the interim, she goes to Spain. Right? Now, a lot of work's been done on this, but in France, in the middle of the 19th century, there became a profound new awareness of older Spanish art, and in particular, Goya and Velázquez. And this came because in 1838, a new gallery of Spanish paintings opened in Paris, the Gallery Espagnole. And as soon as it did, artists started looking back more closely at relatively recent. Goya's not that old. He died in 1820, right? Velázquez, a century earlier. They began looking back at these works and seeing in them something that they haven't seen in French or Flemish painting at all. Right? A sort of liveliness to the brushstrokes that comes out of Velázquez that they were missing. And there became this sort of craze, this amazing interest in all things Spanish in French painting from the 1850s onward. And a lot of people pointed to the opening of the Gallery Espagnole. So with Cassatt's interest, that we see both through channeling Velázquez and picking up on Spanish subjects, that's not unique to Cassatt. That's something that's coming out of the Paris that she had visited, right? And not known to her. Now, when she goes back, right, 1874, it's the same year as the Impressionists, and this is kind of an important issue. The painting on your left, the Spanish dancer picture, she painted while she was in Spain, but she brought it with her when she went back to Paris in 1874. In 1874, she submits it to the annual Salon. We talked about that in this class, haven't we? The French salons? I get my classes all mixed up in my head. In Paris, there was an institution called the Royal Academy, the Académie Royale of France, founded in the 17th century. And from the early 18th century onward, one of the things that the Royal Academy did, it's the Royal Academy of Arts. So it was set up to train artists in traditional ways of painting. Okay? And it was established by the King of France, right? Louis XIII, picked up by Louis XIV. And by the end of the 17th, early 18th century, the Royal Academy begins to mount biennial shows. Now, these days in Europe, well, there's the Venice Biennial, which is kind of a big to-do, right? In Paris, in the Salon Carré, the square court of the Louvre, there was this massive show, usually around 400 works, sometimes it got bigger, of works that were juried by the Board of Trustees of the Royal Academy. Right? They would think of the Cannes Film Festival, right? There's a jury there picking prizes, official entrances, the Cannes Film Festival. Every 2 years there was the Salon, named after the Salon Carré, where artists would submit their best works. The jury would decide which of the works they wanted, which of the works they rejected. Show would go up. They would award prizes, best newcomer, best in show, those sorts of things, right? And aristocrats would show up and would bid on the different pictures, would buy them, right? So it's a great way to get yourself sold to the wealthiest people in town, right? In the country. Okay? These every 2 years, the Salon. Okay? By the 1860s, we start to see artists in France begin to break the rules of traditional painting. Okay? You get a lot of artists who are working in a much more modern fashion that didn't necessarily please the critics at the Salon. They didn't like this. Right? And the more modern fashion was one that was inspired by Velázquez. This sort of open brush work, spontaneity, right? Sort of looking spontaneous. And the critics, the people around the Salon, didn't like this. They thought they were being made fun of. They thought these artists were having a go, right, with them. And mocking the way in which they taught their classes. And so what they started to do was simply reject anything that they thought was not traditional enough, right? And through the course, particularly in the 1860s, a number of works get rejected. Right? Sometimes there's a big sort of to-do about it as well. Right? Back in 1863, the Salon of 1863, there was so many works rejected that there was a public outcry, and the jury of the Salon was forced to open up and show everybody the works that they had rejected. So they had an anti-Salon, if you will, a Salon of the refused works, right? Which became kind of a huge hit, which everyone wanted to see what was so bad. Okay. So through the 1860s, the Salon, right, is still sort of the powerful venue to see new works in France. It's where the most important works are still being seen. But we're starting to get artists being rejected kind of frequently. Monet's one of them, right? Getting rejected all the time. So is Manet, Edward Manet, getting rejected all the time. Because they don't like the sketchy quality, right? They don't like the fact that it's not traditional art. Now, Cassatt submits this to the 1874 Salon, and it's accepted. In other words, it's seen as okay enough. Maybe it's just reference heavy. Maybe they recognize that it's very close to Velázquez, and that made it okay because it's a quasi-foreign subject. I don't want to go into the politics of why, but suffice to say that it was. That same year, 1874, a group of artists had gotten together, 30 or so of them, and called themselves the Society of Independent Artists, and decided to mount a show of their own 2 weeks before the Salon opened. And they were artists whose works had been rejected on multiple occasions by the Salon, and they were sick and tired of it. They're done. Right? We're going to mount our own damn show. We're going to mount our own darn show, and we're not going to subject ourselves to the out of date judgment of these jurors who are choosing for the salon. They're just out of touch. They don't know what art is anymore, right? Or they do art. And they open it 2 weeks before the salon so that they can argue to anybody, oh, we didn't get rejected. We didn't freaking try, right? We don't care anymore. Then had it after the salon open, it would have been a different story. Oh, you guys are just bad that you got rejected, right? No, they opened up 2 weeks before, right? One of the works in the show is the one on the right, and critics were split about 50-50. Liked it, didn't like it. One of the critics who didn't like it said all the works look just like impressions, using this work as the basis of that, right? And the term stuck, and they became known as the Impressionists, right? And they too will mount shows not every year, but infrequently, right? So the next Impressionist show is 1874, the first one. Second one, 1876. Third one, 1877. There are 8 more total, right? 8 total over the next 12 years. Right? Okay, so Cassatt's picture goes into the salon 2 weeks after the Impressionist show opens in 1874. Okay? Other people in the show are going to the salon as well to see what's there. Right? That's still important to them. Like we've got a Manet that was in that show down at the National Gallery. One of the best pictures in the gallery. Right? One of the artists that was in the show, the Impressionist show, that went to the salon was Edgar Degas, one of the founding members of the Impressionists. He saw this, the Spanish dancer, and he said, "Who's this artist?" Cassatt's work, right? She doesn't know her. In fact, it's not the first work she had in the salon. Right? She's got works in the salon back in the 60s. And Akins didn't, right? You kind of think that's why they didn't have much to do with each other. He's a little bit jealous of this woman, and he was getting salon shows he can't. Degas in the 70s sees this in the 1874 salon, wants to find out who is this painter, right? Seeks her out, goes and finds her, and they become immediate friends. And they remain friends for the rest of their lives. And it's a really productive friendship. They seem to feed on each other, and he supplies her with some ideas, but she supplies him with some as well, right? They're working sort of side by side, not like Picasso and Braque, not that close, but there's a lot of things going on between the two of them, right? And nothing sexual. She never marries, right? He's got a family already. It's not like that. It's just that they have a symbiotic artistic relationship where they are inspired by each other, right? 2 great pictures of Cassatt by Degas, right? Accompanying her on various trips to the Louvre Museum in Paris. So on the right, she's looking at pictures in the Louvre. I love this picture. This is so good, right? The way the color explodes around her head, you know. On the left, she's got postcards that she's bought, you know, resting a little bit after a long museum trip. And again, sort of the pain exploding around her head, you know, as she's been inspired by the trip. But they traveled together often. They went, looked at art, talked about art. Degas did numerous pictures of her out and about in the various museums as they were traveling in them together. So we have to keep this in the back of our mind that there's something fruitful, something very good, very positive and beneficial going on between Cassatt on the one hand and Degas on the other. And in 1877, Degas invites her to join the Impressionists as an official member of the group, and she accepts. Right? This is interesting for 2 different reasons. One, she had the Spanish dancer accepted in 1874. She was rejected in 1875 and rejected again in 1877. Degas says, "Come with us." It's like, yeah, duh, my stuff will be seen, right? That's one. Number 2, the Royal Academy also ran the Academy of Fine Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It did not accept women students. So the Royal Academy to Cassatt, not only are they rejecting her works for the salon, but they're also sexist. They're not offering the same opportunities to women as they are to the men. And so this prominent painter with the Impressionists inviting her to join, this must have seemed like, the heavens opening up. Yeah, women are accepted here, right? Women are seen as equals. There are more active and prominent women artists per capita it's still not that many, but more than there are anywhere else in Paris. So for Cassatt, this invitation to join the Impressionists is fantastic. Now, enough Degas, we're talking about Cassatt, right? Here's a painting from her of two women at the opera. Cassatt came from a healthy amount of money. As I mentioned, the rest of her family joined her in 1877. So she doesn't have to worry about her allowance anymore, right? Dad's there with the money, and she was known to have gone to the opera really quite frequently herself. And many of her pictures really do focus on her personal experience. So in this case, we have two young women in a balcony seat, a loge, attending the opera. We are right there with them, right? We're in the loge with them from our point of view. And they're seated in front of a mirror. Okay, so what you see behind you is a reflection of the backs of their bodies on the right. And in the mirror behind them, we see what they're looking at, right? Which is the rest of the opera house. Reflected in a blurry manner in the room, behind them with that massive chandelier. That's also reflected in the mirror, right? All dressed up in their finest for a night out on the town. Now, what's interesting about this picture is a couple of things, and then we'll quit. One is Degas had already been doing images of the theater, right? This could be something that we could look at as having profited from her engagement with Degas, her relationship with Degas, picking up on some of the same thematic subject matter that Degas was painting. A night out at the performances. In his case, it's mostly ballet, and he loves dancers, right? Loves the athletes like Akins does, and depicts us now at the ballet. As we look at Degas' pictures of life at the ballet and Cassatt's pictures of life at the ballet, we can see the difference. Degas loves to put us behind the scenes, up on the stage, next to the ballerinas. Now, ballerinas were financially supported by wealthy aristocrats in Paris. That shadowy element down by the signature is probably the shoulder of one of these sugar daddies, for lack of a better word, who support the ballerinas, most of whom came from very, very poor backgrounds. He gives us this view of the kind of people he is, right? Wealthy men. Degas came from a very, very wealthy family as well, right? And shows us the opera world from his point of view. Behind the scenes, more of our top-hatted benefactors, with the curtain rising behind them, right? This is Degas' perception of the theater, right? Working guys over their proteges. For Cassatt, right, we are right there. It's the idea of looking down on it from the loge, from a protected alcove, rather than out and engaged with the rest of the community. And this is the key part of this, right, is the degree to which Cassatt's images reflect what it was like to be a woman in Paris in the 19th century. The Impressionists were very forward-looking. They're very modern in their acceptance of women as equals. But the rest of Paris was not. Paris in the Third Republic, for a woman to be out in public alone, it was a taboo. Right? A woman out in public alone was seen as loose, available. Right? The only way you could be out in public would be escorted, or if you obviously had a job like a nanny with a child, those things made it okay. But to simply wander the streets like the other Impressionists might have done, to mill around the rest of the opera was for Cassatt impossible. Right? she gives us a tighter, closing view of life in the Loge. And as these women are out, and there are two women together, which makes it somewhat safe. Maybe there's three women together, we count Cassatt. Right? There's still fear. Covering up her face. Right? Hiding behind that fan. A wariness. A knowledge that they are on display. That they are being looked at. And not necessarily in a totally positive way. They are being scrutinized. Right? I'll show you one more picture real quick. This one's up in Boston. One of the great Cassatts. But there's probably a self-portrait, I can't say for sure. Right? But a woman doing what our girls are doing, watching the display. But look at the guy behind her. Right? That's exactly what's happening to these girls. There's a guy who's using his opera glasses to look at her. Right? That's what these women are protecting themselves from, insulating themselves from. And as we look at Cassatt's work, right, it shares something with Degas. They're both painting elements of their life and how they want it to be seen. But for Cassatt, this is what it was like to be a woman in late 19th century France, which is a lot about being enclosed. Right? Being in public view, but not necessarily liking it. And that's what we'll look at then as we come back to Cassatt on Tuesday. So remember that, let's see, everybody's here on Tuesday, right? Next week we've got 2 more classes. In lieu of the final and finals week, we'll be going to the museum together. If you don't come, you'll flunk the final. How's that for the easiest final to get an A on ever? Show up to the freaking museum, right? We'll go look at this stuff and some other things in person in the National Gallery during test week. Okay? So good luck finishing up your paper.